So it's completely different. It's changed dramatically. I never thought that I could dream this big. I never thought that I would be achieving what I am today.
There's a pattern that plays out on talent shows almost every single season. A contestant walks out, delivers one unforgettable moment, gets a wave of headlines, and then quietly fades into the background once the cameras move on to the next big story. Winners sometimes escape that fate. Runners-up almost never do. So when someone finishes in 5th place, doesn't land a record deal, doesn't chase a viral single, and still manages to build a full-time career nearly a decade later, it's worth asking what actually happened. That's the case with Sal Valentinetti. Most people remember him as the pizza delivery guy who walked onto the America's Got Talent stage in 2016, sang My Way like he'd been doing it his whole life, and earned Heidi Klum's golden buzzer. What most people don't know is what came after. Because while dozens of his fellow contestants eventually disappeared from the spotlight, Sal quietly built something that looks less like reality TV luck and more like a deliberate, sustainable business. So where is he now? And how did he pull it off? Think about how strange that actually is for a moment. The entertainment industry is built almost entirely around momentum. Labels, managers, and promoters chase whoever is trending that particular month, because attention is currency, and attention fades fast. A 5th place finish on a talent show should, by every normal rule of that industry, translate into a short burst of visibility and then silence. Instead, Sal's career arguably got more serious after the show ended than it was during it. That inversion, declining television exposure paired with rising career stability, is rare enough that it's worth slowing down and tracing exactly how it happened, starting from before anyone in Hollywood knew his name. Sal grew up in Bethpage, a modest, close-knit town on Long Island, in a household where nobody was pushing him toward stage. His parents, Maria and Steve, weren't in the entertainment world, and there was no manager grooming him from childhood the way there sometimes is with young performers. If anything, his upbringing was the opposite of glamorous. Music was present in the house, but it wasn't treated as a career track. It was just something that played in the background. The person who actually shaped his musical taste wasn't a teacher or a producer. It was his grandmother. She had a deep love for the golden age of American singers, Sinatra, Dean Martin, Tony Bennett, Bobby Darin. And those records became the soundtrack of Sal's childhood. While his classmates were memorizing whatever was on the radio at the time, Sal was absorbing songs that were decades old before he was even born. He wasn't doing it strategically. He just liked the way it sounded. But that early exposure ended up shaping the entire identity he'd later build a career on. Interestingly, singing wasn't even his focus growing up. He was more invested in instruments, working his way through baritone horn, tuba, bass trumpet, and trombone. Nobody, including Sal himself, was treating him like a future vocalist. That changed almost by accident. At 15, during a horn lesson with his instructor, Dr. Joseph Merkel, a well-regarded private music teacher in the Long Island area, Sal was asked to play something. Instead of picking up his instrument, he started singing the lyrics to Bobby Darin's Mac the Knife, a song tied to those childhood memories with his grandmother. Merkel stopped him. He'd clearly heard something in that voice that Sal hadn't noticed in himself, and he encouraged him to take singing seriously. Even with that encouragement, nothing changed overnight. Sal wasn't chasing a music career at that point. He finished high school at Holy Trinity in Hicksville and enrolled at St. John's University in Queens to study communication arts, eventually joining the Catholic Scholars Program and co-hosting a talk show on the campus radio station. He even ended up as the station's first director of public relations. On paper, this looked like the trajectory of someone heading toward broadcasting, not toward a stage career. It's worth pointing out just how ordinary that path looked from the outside. He wasn't skipping classes to chase auditions. He wasn't posting cover songs online hoping to get discovered. He was a college student juggling coursework, a part-time job, and campus activities, the same as thousands of other 20-year-olds on Long Island. If you'd stopped him on campus at St. John's and asked what he planned to do after graduation, singing professionally almost certainly wouldn't have been the first answer. That ordinariness matters, because it's part of why his eventual audition felt so different from the polished, clearly rehearsed backstories a lot of talent show contestants arrive with. His story wasn't manufactured for television. It was just true. To help cover the cost of college, Sal took a job delivering pizzas for his cousin's restaurant back in Bethpage. It's easy to treat that detail as a throwaway fact in his origin story, but it mattered more than people realize. Night after night, he was knocking on strangers' doors, making small talk, reading people's moods in seconds, and figuring out how to leave them in a better mood than he found them in. That's not something you can learn from vocal lessons or a communications degree. It's a skill built entirely through repetition with real people, and it later became one of his biggest strengths as a performer, the ability to hold a room and make an audience feel like he was talking directly to them. At the time, none of this felt like preparation for anything. It was just a way to keep gas in his car and pay a few bills. Singing was still very much a side interest, not a plan. There's a broader lesson buried in this stretch of his life that's easy to skip past. A lot of people assume that stage presence is something you either have from childhood or something you develop through years of formal training, vocal coaches, drama classes, competitive choirs. Sal's version of that development looked completely different. It came from standing on strangers' doorsteps night after night, trying to earn a decent tip through nothing but personality and timing. He wasn't performing songs during those interactions, but he was constantly performing in a broader sense. Reading whether someone wanted quick small talk or a longer conversation, figuring out when to be funny and when to just be polite and move on. Those instincts translate directly to a stage, where a performer has to read an entire room instead of just one person on a doorstep. It's a strange, indirect kind of training, but it clearly worked. Before America's Got Talent ever entered the picture, Sal actually tried out for American Idol during its 14th season. He made it to Hollywood Week after singing Sinatra's Fly Me to the Moon, even splitting the judges. Harry Connick Jr. passed on him, while Jennifer Lopez and Adam Levine sent him forward. He performed again during Hollywood Week, took part in a small group performance, and then was eliminated. No big send-off, no dramatic story arc, just an ending that came and went. By his own later admission, that Idol run wasn't even something he took fully seriously. It reportedly started as something closer to a bet with his uncle. If the judges responded to him, it would prove something. If they didn't, life would go on exactly as it had been. It wasn't treated as a make-or-break shot at stardom. For a lot of people, that kind of quiet elimination could easily be the end of the story. Reality competition shows have a way of making early rejection feel like a verdict on your entire future. But Sal didn't treat it that way. Instead of walking away from performing, he kept doing small, unglamorous gigs, restaurants, private parties, local events that paid next to nothing. There was no strategy behind it beyond simply wanting to keep singing. But those small rooms taught him something television never could: how to hold an audience's attention without editing, lighting, or a built-in fan base cheering him on before he even opened his mouth. Consider what those gigs actually demanded of him. A restaurant crowd isn't there to watch a singer. They're there to eat dinner, catch up with friends, maybe celebrate a birthday. Winning that room over means competing with clinking silverware, side conversations, and people who might not even notice there's live music happening until you make them notice. It's a much harder audience to win than a room full of people who already tuned in specifically to watch a singing competition. By the time Sal eventually stepped onto the America's Got Talent stage, he'd already spent years learning how to earn attention from people who weren't required to give it to him. That's a very different skill set than simply having a good voice, and it's one of the quieter reasons his audition felt so immediately commanding. In 2016, at 20 years old, Sal auditioned for America's Got Talent. He walked out in a sharp suit, introduced himself as a pizza delivery driver, charmed the judges with some quick banter, and then chose one of the hardest songs imaginable to sing in front of a room full of skeptics: Sinatra's My Way. It's a song everyone already knows, which means there's nowhere to hide if you can't deliver. He delivered. The room noticeably shifted the moment he started singing. By the end, all 4 judges were on their feet, and Heidi Klum ran up on stage, hugged him, and hit her golden buzzer, sending him straight through to the live rounds. Sal broke down in tears and said the moment felt like the first day of the rest of his life. Overnight, A guy who'd been delivering pizzas a few days earlier became one of the most talked about new names on national television. That single clip ended up traveling far beyond the show's regular audience, eventually racking up hundreds of millions of views across various platforms worldwide. That kind of number usually creates a short, intense spike of attention that burns out within a few weeks, as people move on to whatever clip goes viral next. What's notable about Sal's case is that he didn't treat that viral moment as the finish line. He treated it as an opening, a way to get people curious enough to check out a live show, rather than something that was supposed to carry his entire career on its own. But a golden buzzer isn't a finish line. It's the start of a much harder stretch. Once that kind of spotlight lands on you, every following performance is expected to top the last one, and plenty of past golden buzzer recipients have stumbled trying to meet that pressure by playing it safe. Sal went the opposite direction. For his quarterfinal performance, instead of sticking to a safe, obvious choice, he took One Direction's Story of My Life and reworked it into a swing-era jazz number. A genuinely risky move that could have easily fallen flat with the audience. It didn't. The judges gave him standing ovations again, and even though he landed in the bottom tier of the public vote, he was saved by the judges' save option and moved on. Behind the scenes, Sal was also going through a quiet, personal transformation that had nothing to do with performing. Between his initial audition and his semi-final appearance, he lost close to 50 pounds. At the time, he weighed over 300 pounds, was pre-diabetic, and had concerning blood pressure numbers. He later said plainly that he did it for his own health, not for the show. Making that change while rehearsing constantly and performing live on national television took real discipline. Going months without touching foods he loved, working with a trainer, and sticking to it under public pressure the entire time. Remember, this was someone who worked at a pizza shop, surrounded daily by pasta, cannoli, and fresh pies, and he simply chose not to touch any of it for months, while everyone around him was eating exactly that. Doing that quietly, without turning it into a dramatic storyline for the cameras, says something about how seriously he was already thinking about the long term, even in the middle of what could have easily felt like a once-in-a-lifetime, short-term opportunity. He carried that momentum into the semifinals with a Sinatra classic and advanced to the finals, where he sang Mac the Knife, the very song that had first revealed his talent back in that horn lesson years earlier. For the finale itself, he joined the Jersey Boys for December 1963, Oh What a Night, bringing the crowd to its feet one more time. When the votes were finally counted, Sal finished in 5th place, behind the eventual winner and 3 other finalists. He didn't take home the trophy, and yet somehow he ended up being one of the most memorable names from that entire season, which says something, considering plenty of people who finished higher than him have since faded from public memory almost entirely. This is where Sal's story splits off from the typical pattern. Most reality show finalists wait around for a label deal or a viral moment to carry them forward. Sal didn't wait for anything. Within months of the finale, he was already booked into real theaters, proper stages with paying, repeat audiences, not the kind of small rooms he'd been playing for years. He performed at venues on Long Island, took stages tied to events around Madison Square Garden, and opened for Jay Leno during a run in Las Vegas. These aren't the kinds of bookings that fall into a 5th-place finisher's lap by accident. Promoters kept inviting him back, and in several cities, shows sold out faster than expected. Rather than trying to modernize his sound to chase whatever was popular at the time, Sal doubled down on exactly the style that got him noticed in the first place. He released a debut EP called The Voice in 2017, filled with classic covers. He followed it with a Christmas album, and later, on Valentine's Day in 2021, released Little Valentine, recorded in the same Hollywood studio where Sinatra himself had once worked. None of these projects tried to sound current. They leaned fully into the era he'd loved since childhood, betting that there was still an audience hungry for that kind of music performed with real sincerity, not as a nostalgia act, but as a living continuation of it. That bet paid off. His audiences ended up spanning generations in a way most modern acts can't replicate. Grandparents who grew up with the actual Rat Pack bringing their grandchildren to shows, and younger listeners discovering that sound for the first time through him. It's a kind of cross-generational pull that's genuinely rare, and it gave his career a durability that a lot of viral-first artists never managed to build. Sal also returned to the America's Got Talent stage more than once over the years, including an appearance on America's Got Talent, The Champions in 2019, where he performed Mac the Knife, again to more standing ovations, even though he didn't advance that time. He sang a holiday duet with Heidi Klum during one of the show's specials, and he even performed New York, New York ahead of the Belmont Stakes in 2022, a small but telling sign of how far his profile had traveled beyond the show that first introduced him. There's also a business decision underneath all of this that doesn't get talked about as much as the music itself. Rather than signing away creative control to a major label in exchange for a bigger short-term push, Sal has largely operated independently, booking his own tour dates and keeping ownership over his releases. That path is slower and comes with none of the marketing muscle a major label could offer. But it also means he isn't beholden to executives deciding what direction his sound should take next. Every date on his calendar, every project he releases, reflects his own judgment about what his audience wants rather than what a corporate release schedule demands. In an industry where plenty of talented performers get shaped, reshaped, and eventually discarded by labels chasing trends, that independence has arguably been just as important to his longevity as the music itself. It also means his growth has been almost entirely word of mouth and relationship driven. Promoters who booked him once kept bringing him back because audiences kept showing up and buying tickets again for the next show. That's a much slower, less flashy version of building a career than landing a hit single. But it's also considerably more durable because it isn't dependent on repeating a single spike of attention. Every sold-out room adds to a foundation instead of representing an isolated event that has to be top next time. Beyond music itself, Sal began co-hosting a podcast called Breaking Bread, where he interviews members of the Italian-American community across New York's boroughs. It's not a vanity project built to promote his own name. It functions more like a celebration of the culture and community that shaped him, giving other people a platform to share their own stories. That kind of project doesn't do much for short-term visibility, but it says a lot about the way he's approached staying connected to where he came from instead of drifting away from it as his career grew. Projects like that rarely show up in a typical breakdown of someone's career because they don't move the needle on ticket sales or streaming numbers in any measurable way. But they matter for a different reason. A performer who only shows up for the things that directly benefit his own visibility tends to come across as calculated, even if audiences can't always articulate why a certain public figure feels less genuine than another. Spending time highlighting other people's stories, without folding it into his own music career, is the kind of choice that reinforces the sense that his connection to his community isn't a marketing angle. It's simply part of who he is, on and off a stage. It's worth pausing on just how counterintuitive Sal's core decision really was. When a young performer breaks through on a major platform, the standard advice from almost anyone in the industry is to capitalize on that exposure by modernizing quickly, chase current production trends, work with contemporary songwriters, maybe collaborate with artists who already have an established younger fan base. That's the playbook that turns a viral moment into mainstream pop relevance, at least in theory. Sal ignored that playbook almost entirely. He kept building his identity around big band arrangements, tailored suits, and songs that were already considered nostalgic when his own parents were growing up. On the surface, this looks like the opposite of a smart career move. Crooner-style music isn't dominating streaming charts, and there's no obvious commercial lane on modern radio for songs built around orchestras and standards from the 1940s and 1950s. But that's exactly what made his approach work in a live setting. A crowded market is usually a market full of people trying to sound like whatever's currently popular. Standing out in that kind of environment often means doing the opposite of what everyone else is doing, as long as you can do it with genuine skill and conviction rather than as a gimmick. Sal wasn't performing nostalgia, ironically, or as a novelty act. He grew up steeped in that music through his grandmother, so the performance never felt like a costume. It felt like an extension of who he actually was. Audiences can generally tell the difference between a performer imitating a style and one who has simply always lived inside it. That authenticity is also what allowed his shows to pull in such a wide range of ages. Older audience members who remember hearing these songs the first time around get an experience that feels genuinely faithful to the source material, not a watered-down tribute act. Younger audience members, many of whom have never heard this kind of music performed live at all, get introduced to an entire era of American songwriting they might otherwise never encounter outside of old movies or their grandparents' record collections. Very few working musicians manage to bridge that generational gap as naturally as Sal has. And it's a big part of why his ticket sales have stayed consistent rather than depending on any single demographic staying loyal indefinitely. One of the more understated parts of Sal's story is his continued relationship with Heidi Klum, the judge who gave him that golden buzzer in the first place. Reality show relationships between contestants and judges are often assumed to be manufactured for the cameras and forgotten the moment the season wraps. That hasn't been the case here. Klum has continued to check in on his career over the years, at one point catching one of his shows at a jazz club in Los Angeles years after the show ended. Sal posted about the visit, clearly moved that she'd shown up. It's a small detail, but it reinforces something about his story. The connections he built during his time on the show weren't just transactional. Some of them stuck. In his personal life, Sal got engaged to his longtime girlfriend, Gianna, in December 2022. He's been open on social media about how much her support has meant to him, especially through difficult stretches, including his health journey. The 50 pounds he lost during his AGT run wasn't the end of that story. Years later, in January 2024, Sal underwent gastric sleeve surgery. On his 28th birthday that August, he shared before and after photos with a blunt, honest caption pointing out everything that was missing from the earlier picture. Roughly 130 additional pounds, type 2 diabetes, sleep apnea, and the need for a seatbelt extender. He credited Gianna directly for helping him through the 7-month process. It would have been easy to frame that surgery as being about appearance. It wasn't. It was about wanting a long career and a long life, and being honest enough to admit he needed real medical help to get there, something plenty of people struggle to admit publicly, let alone while their health details end up circulating online. Nearly a decade removed from that first audition, Sal is still touring. His schedule runs through cities across the country, Boca Raton, Philadelphia, New York, California, filled with theater dates, private events, corporate bookings, and casino performances. He still lives in Bethpage, the same town he grew up in, still shouts out his old neighborhood, and still posts the kind of low-key, genuine social media updates that don't look manufactured for engagement. What makes his story stand out isn't some dramatic twist. It's the complete absence of one. He didn't get pulled into a scandal. He didn't burn out chasing relevance. He didn't need a viral moment to stay afloat. He simply kept working, touring, releasing music independently, building relationships with fans who kept showing up night after night, and staying loyal to a sound that plenty of people probably assumed had no commercial future left in it. That last part might be the most important piece of the whole story. Sal never tried to reinvent himself into whatever was trending. He bet on authenticity over trend chasing, on independence over waiting for a label to hand him a career, and on consistency over chasing one more viral spike. In an industry built on overnight breakthroughs and short attention spans, he chose the slower, less flashy route, and it turned out to be the one that actually lasted. It's also worth comparing his path to the more familiar cautionary tales that circulate about reality television. There are countless stories of contestants who won their seasons outright, landed the record deal, released one project, and then vanished within a couple of years once the label moved on to the next discovery. There are just as many stories of talented finalists who assumed that a strong finish alone would be enough to sustain a career, only to find out that television exposure doesn't automatically convert into ticket sales once the show stops airing reruns of your audition. Sal avoided both traps, not through some brilliant strategic masterstroke, but through a fairly